us start off with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this day. It's called Passion Week coming up, so we celebrate next week. And on Friday, what you did for us that we could not do. We thank you for that, Lord, that we have an easy part to our share of the load that we have. Lord, help us to continually think on that this week coming up and to share your good news throughout the world. We ask your blessing for this morning's videos that you show us what your creation and the flood had happened and some of the wonderful animals that you had made. Help us as we go through today, that you open our hearts and our minds to what you want us to understand today. I ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So here we have Marcus Ross. I think you'll be surprised with some of the things that he brings forth. Some of the things that when I first watched it was, oh wow, never thought of it like that. Of course, I've been doing it a lot.
Steve and I saw these nautiloid fossils in the Grand Canyon. How do they fit in that overall fossil record?
Well, one of the things I like about natural history museums is they often have dioramas like this, which lay out a whole series of different ecosystems and communities. And in this one, you've got Cambrian and Ordovician and a whole bunch of those weird terms that are in there. And your nautiloids are in here somewhere, right? They were in the Grand Canyon. And so what we're seeing with these is the community structure, the community makeup. What are the animals, what are the plants that are found in some of those layers? And in the Grand Canyon, as well as everywhere else, those layers are stacked on one another in order to form the fossil record of the geological column.
Okay.
And what the fossil record is really those stacks of layers with the communities in them. And we use the fossils like the Post-it notes to figure out where exactly we might happen to be in those layered communities. So the trick is, the real data are these stacks of rocks that have fossils in them. The interpretation is then how those stacks of rocks came to exist, and why is it that some communities of animals in these rocks look the same or different from ones that are below. These dioramas show us what each of those individual communities would have looked like. And from a creation perspective, what I like about this is it gets us the idea of what if we were transitioning from deeper water communities to progressively more and more shallow communities as we go through, because one of the big pictures that we have in the fossil record is that the lower units are dominated by marine organisms, by shells, clams, trilobites, things like that. The higher that you get up, the more terrestrial organisms start showing up. It's as if, all the stuff in the ocean is being destroyed, and then eventually the stuff on land starts getting destroyed too. And then sooner or later you get to the end of the flood and other things are going on after the flood. But big picture-wise, we have this overall shift from lots and lots of marine organisms to transition to some terrestrial to mostly terrestrial, and then the flood is probably done. So one of the things that we can see here is that we've got communities. Right here, we have the Cambrian community. And that is on this side. If you want to think about the Grand Canyon, take the Grand Canyon, tip it sideways.
Okay.
So you tipped everything sideways. Here's the Great Unconformity.
All right.
Back over here, those are the granites and the non-fossil bearing rocks. The Great Unconformity, and then the first thing that we find is this community that has been pulled up and deposited and thrust over the continent and deposited in what's now Arizona. And inside that are things like these predatory critters called Anomalocaris. You've got trilobites. There are sponge-like creatures down over here. There's little echinoderms. There's a functional community there. As we move closer to the shore, think of that as a bit of a deep water environment. Moving a little bit closer to the shore, we start getting into a shallow carbonate reef. And that carbonate reef has got some corals in it. It's got a group of brachiopods. Nautiloids start showing up. Now, they're not the same nautiloids you see in Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon does have some other nautiloids. That's the Ordovician group. As we keep moving closer and closer towards shore, we're picking up more and more organisms. So again, more sea scorpions in this case start showing up. We end up with more nautiloids, fish of wide and very odd variety. And as we come closer still, we keep getting just a little bit closer to shore until eventually, once we get into the Mississippian, which for the Grand Canyon has got the nautiloids, but on the other side of the country, when you're in the Appalachians, this is the coal-bearing units. Explaining those coal beds is an interesting trick because the plants are not like pines and oaks and things like that we see. They're very, very odd, different, even somewhat cylindrical and hollow plants. Some creationists think that this might actually represent a forest that was floating out as kind of a subcontinent-sized mat of vegetation to explain the types of plants that we see making up those coal beds. So by the time we get to something like the Mississippian, we're right near the shore or on the shore and getting terrestrial environments. We're starting to get terrestrial organisms. By the time we're in the Mississippian, we're starting to see amphibians. Okay? But curiously, the first evidence that we have of the amphibians isn't the bodies, it's the trackways. And then we start seeing the amphibians themselves. So it looks like they were running away from something, but they get caught and they get buried. And we transition over and we get into the Pennsylvanian. And in this, we start seeing the very first reptiles. Again, thinking kind of from the bottom up, what's finally getting buried.
Right.
We're getting more and more progressive towards the shore, right? Towards the land environments. And once we get past this and in through what's called the Permian, the next group after this that continues on would be the Mesozoic, with the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, right? The age of dinosaurs. Very terrestrial. There's still marine stuff going on because the waves of the flood are still taking the marine organisms and pushing them onto the continent. But by this time, you're also flooding so much of the continent that the terrestrial animals are being captured and buried and dragged. As we go through this whole thing, and we've got community after community after community after community, right? My evolutionary colleagues look at these as communities over time. For the creationists, though, this isn't communities over time. These are all living at the same time. They're just not living in the same place. And the order that we have in the rock record, from the Great Unconformity on up, shows us a reflection of ecosystems that are being sequentially buried that happen to live at the same time. So this diagram is great because it does take that vertical section of rock and it tips it on its side, exactly how a creationist would look at this, as going deep water to shallow water to the land. And this, I think, is one of the ways that the creationists can take a look at the fossil record, start making testable hypotheses and predictions about what we should find, and make sense of otherwise what seems to be a fairly curious set of data.
So both paradigms are looking at the same fossil record.
Yeah.
The data is the same for both of them.
Yeah. And we're trying to interpret those data in the way that we best can and see which one of these paradigms makes the most sense out of the data. Effectively, this wall right here takes what we just walked through, right? And it takes it vertical because the reality is in the rocks, that's where you find it.
Yeah, this is what we saw in the canyon.
Yeah, the Grand Canyon. Here's the rocks of the continent. Right here are those granites and metamorphic rocks. The black is the Great Unconformity. And then you've got your Cambrian, your Ordovician, your Silurian, your Devonian, and on and up the rock column we go. So really what we're recognizing is that we have these patterns of rocks. Inside those rocks are certain types of fossils. And both paradigms are seeking to come about with an explanation that makes the best sense of all the data. So Del, when you were in the Grand Canyon, you were looking at rocks from this unit.
Okay.
And we call this, you can see at the top there, the Paleozoic rocks. The Paleozoic means ancient life. So in an old Earth view, this is kind of the older life forms of things that are primitive, so to speak. Then above that is another unit. So this is the Paleozoic. Above the Paleozoic is what's called the Mesozoic. It means middle life, and it has the more familiar Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rocks. So all those dinosaurs that are here in the museum are coming from those rock layers, and those rock layers are located on top of and not in the Grand Canyon, so you didn't see them there. But then on top of the Mesozoic, there's even more rocks. And those are the Cenozoic, means the recent life, and it's called that because it typically has mammals and birds and other things that are more familiar to the world that we live in right now.
Would humans be found then in that top layer?
Yeah, within the rock record, the only place where human fossils are found are actually at the very, very top of the Cenozoic. Now, I have to be honest, from a young Earth creation perspective, my expectation would be that there would be some humans in the flood rocks, because the way I look at things, the Paleozoic are made during the flood. The Mesozoic rocks with the dinosaurs are made during the flood, right? Just other ecosystems that are being destroyed. And then the Cenozoic is probably representing the world that reestablishes itself when the flood is over. So one of the curious things that we find in the Cenozoic is, we've got all of these mammals of different kinds, and early horses, early deer, whales, things like that. and the humans aren't found until the very top. That could be because the humans don't actually go out from the spreading point until much later on. Now, why they're not found in the flood rocks is a more difficult problem for young Earth creationists. It's one of those data points that doesn't seem to cut our way, at least at first blush. Creationists have a variety of different ways in which they might address that. Maybe the human population wasn't very large. Maybe it was concentrated in certain areas that didn't lend themselves to fossilization. Or maybe people, being clever, were able to avoid most of the initial destruction of the flood that built all of this. And most of the next stuff, so maybe people were capable of escaping. I don't know that any one of those solves it. Maybe a combination does, or maybe we need other bright minds to come through and give us some ideas, because within science, there's so much we don't know. I mean, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, there's so much that we don't know that, I'm itching for more colleagues so that I can have fun conversations.
Right. So we're still trying to answer some of those questions on both paradigms. Is that correct?
Yeah. The thing about science is every answer that you get leads you to another 2 or 3 or 4 questions. It's not even just, I got that answer, I got one more question. Usually you have a couple more. And so, discovery is something that is exciting. Discovery is something that's fun. It's why people go out and collect dinosaur bones. And once they find out, okay, this is what a T-Rex is, but then they start asking, well, how come it's built this way? Or what do you do with the arms? Or how come the head's so big? Or why is the tail this long? Right? Once you get an idea of something overall, but then you get into the more specific questions, in every discipline, things get more interesting when you start, really getting down in the weeds of the details. And that's where things get fun.
Yeah. Well, Marcus, we've been looking at the details of the fossil record. Let's step back a second and kind of chronologically walk through all of this.
Well, the Bible provides us with important anchor points over which things were going on. We've got the events of Creation Week, the events of the fall, we've got the events of the flood, and the events of the post-flood world. But they're very sketchy details. I mean, when we think about it, all of this history, which spans more than 1,600 years, 1,700 years, is in just about 8 chapters. Right? And most of that is in 1 chapter worth of genealogies that skips through all the time until then. So as important as the biblical framework is for us in providing us with key points in which to build our hypotheses and ideas, the only way to get a lot of the answers is to go to the rocks. You've got to go to the fossil record, you've got to go to the rocks, you've got to go to biology, you've got to go to the different disciplines of science to tease out the details that God hasn't seen fit to tell us directly in His Word, because that's not the point of the biblical record. The biblical record's point is to tell us what has happened and why we're in the state that we're in. Why is it that the world is the mess that it is in? Now, the events of creation geologically are really interesting because God's forming the basic materials of the world. The making of the continents. On day 3, we call this the great upheaval, as God raises the land up out of the sea. There must be profound geological activity going on, not only in the formation of rock, but of granites and metamorphic rocks, but also all the erosions creating huge amounts of non-fossil bearing sedimentary rocks. You saw some of those in the Grand Canyon. There are sedimentary rocks below the unconformity, but they don't have animal fossils in them. So that makes sense that they would belong in a Creation Week setting.
Do you think this is part of what we read in Peter when he's talking about how God formed the earth by water and through water? So it's almost as if He was using the actions of water in the very beginning.
Yeah, from day 1 in Creation Week, we find that God said He created the heavens and the earth was without form, it was void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, right? It was basically a watery ball of mush that hasn't yet been organized into something that could support life. And so day 2, God separates the waters so that now we have a distinction between atmospheric waters and waters on the earth itself. And day 3, God then pulls the land up out of the waters in order to create continents versus oceans, and finally calls them seas because they're now organized and distinct from the land. So yeah, Peter is definitely pulling back from that in order to get the imagery to remind us that the world was created with water.
Yes.
And that by those waters, as Peter says, the world was then deluged and destroyed. So this gives us a clue. It's one of those few points in the Bible that gives us a little bit of a clue that it's the waters of the world that destroyed the world at the time of the flood, and brought us to a point at the pinnacle of the flood story where it says, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days, and only Noah was left and those who were with him on the ark. The world is brought back to the same state at the middle of the flood that it was at the beginning of creation. It's this watery ball of unformedness with chaos going underneath as animals are being destroyed and buried and turned into fossils. But that's part of the whole point. God is resetting the world using Noah as a fresh representative of the human race like Adam. He's preserving the animals. He's not going to remake them. God's not in the business of recreating the world after the flood. So we see the flood narrative pulls a lot from what's going on in Creation Week, but it does so in an interesting way. Mark Twain's rumored to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what we see is a thematic continuity in the Bible between how the world was formed and how it is reshaped by the flood.
Well, are there other clues in that Genesis history that helps us understand exactly how God then destroyed the earth?
Yeah, the first clue comes in Genesis chapter 6, in the prelude to the flood itself, when God says, "Behold, I am going to destroy the earth with the earth." Now, as a geologist, that's tantalizing. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what that phrase means, but God destroying the world with the earth means that the earth is complicit in some way, that God is directing the planet to destroy itself.
So he may not speak in some supernatural way, which he could, but it sounds like he's going to use that which is already there.
That's right. There's certainly a supernatural component to the flood. It wouldn't have happened without God's divine command for this to occur. But nevertheless, God is also using the material components of the earth to do the flood itself. So we don't have some miraculous source of water for the flood. The water for the flood is the same waters that actually we still have around us today. The waters from the ocean were pushed over the continents by a variety of different tectonic activities. Now, tectonics for a geologist is simply a fancy way of saying when rocks move. Rocks of the crust, the continental crust, but also the ocean crust. Over the past couple of decades, creation geologists have been working up and trying to tune a concept called catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, we learn about plate tectonics in high school and maybe in college if you take a class in geology or earth science. And today, the plates, the ocean and the continental crust material, move fairly slowly, a few centimeters a year. But if catastrophic plate tectonics is correct, then the movements of those plates actually was happening very, very quickly and is the mechanism by which the flood occurred.
Do you think that's the first thing that happened?
Yeah, that as the fountains of the great deep broke apart and the windows of heaven were opened, that basically the crust begins to rupture and fracture and break. Plumes of magma start to invade into the area. That vaporizes a lot of water from the ocean, because if these magmas are coming in and hitting the bottom of the ocean, they're over 1,000 degrees centigrade. I mean, they're really, really hot. And that's going to vaporize a bunch of water, which will then kind of cool and radiate some heat out into space and then come back down as rain. And that begins that 40 days and 40 nights of intense rainfall. Now, in Sunday school, we think the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. But reading the biblical text, the flood lasts over a year. The 40 days and 40 nights is just the first period of intense rainfall. So we've got a geological clue in Genesis about what's going on. The fountains of the great deep break, the windows of heaven were open, so we have something going on geologically to rupture the planet, and that seems to trigger this massive and unusual rain onto the earth.
So we're not talking about the old nursery rhyme where just all of a sudden water, rain comes down.
Right. Something
horribly wrong, if you want to look at it from the standpoint of the people who are there, is beginning to happen. You're talking about the crust of the earth breaking open, and it's not just water now, you're talking about hot magma coming up.
Hot magma coming up, vaporizing parts of the ocean water, movements of continents at kilometers an hour, a couple of miles per hour. Now, that doesn't seem very fast because you can walk, a couple of miles an hour. But if you're in the North American continent, moving at 4 miles an hour is really devastating. And that North American continent is moving this direction, and the African continent is moving towards the same point. And when those two things hit together, they end up colliding and crumpling and creating mountain belts. So one thing that we have to think about is that the geography of the world before the flood is very different from the geography that we have today. Today we've got North America and South America, and across the Atlantic you've got Europe and Africa and Asia. But the construction of the continents was very different. If this is North America now, and the equator's down over here, when the flood started, North America was actually down here somewhere. My home state of Virginia was in the southern hemisphere near the Tropic of Capricorn. That's a totally different view of the world. So things shifted, rotated, and moved and collided. The reason that we have the Appalachian Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands and places like the Atlas Mountains in Morocco that are now found on 3 different continents all belong to a single mountain chain that was built when those continents collided. The idea of Pangaea, this large single supercontinent, wasn't the way that God created the world. That was actually a continent that existed and was formed during the flood. And then it broke apart and split away, and the continents moved again at several miles an hour away from one another as the Atlantic Ocean formed for the very first time. There was no Atlantic Ocean. This means that the Garden of Eden wasn't in the ancient Middle East, because the ancient Middle East isn't where it is today. So trying to find it by clues and saying, well, maybe the Tigris and Euphrates point us to where Eden is a fool's errand, because the purpose of the flood, once again, is to destroy the world completely and utterly. You can't find Eden because it's not there.
And that's what Peter tells us, that the Lord destroyed the world. In fact, even speaks of it as a world that was.
Yes.
So you're right. We couldn't find those things because they're no longer there.
Yeah, the geography is completely different. Other mountain belts happen a little bit later on. The Rocky Mountains out where you live are gorgeous and spectacular, and they're huge compared to the Appalachians that I grew up around. But the reason that the Appalachians are so small is because they were eroded during the flood, whereas the Rockies popped up towards the end of the flood and haven't suffered nearly as much erosion. When the Appalachians actually got crushed together along with the Atlas Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands, they could have been as big as the Himalayas, but because the waters of the flood kept eroding them as they were coming up, they never made it quite that big. And as the continents move and the waters start to drain away as the flood ends a year after it started, you start to see the major geographic features of the world taking shape. We've got a Gulf of Mexico, we've got the Rocky Mountains, we've got the position of the continents getting close to where they are today. So our ideas about these things get really exciting because they hint us at a past that was so utterly and completely different than our present. I think one of the big distinctions between the conventional view of ancient ages and evolutionary theory and a biblical paradigm in which we're looking at anchor points of biblical history to help guide us is that we've got those as historical markers. Right, that the flood is an event that happened, but not just that the Bible said that it happened, but it also provides us with some understanding of how long it happened after creation. It gives us an idea of about how long it took between the flood and the birth of Abram, for example, which gets us to Israel's history and whatnot. So it's not like you can take the early chapters of Genesis, as some have tried, and said, well, it's just a primeval history that is detached from real history. It's not detached from real history. It's a continuous flow going back through time, and it's one that has singular events. And that's what Peter was helping to remind the Jews at the time that he was writing, that this is a singular event that was so utterly and completely different from everything else. That's why we know that Jesus' return is going to be an actual event that is completely and utterly different from everything else. History builds upon itself, and God does not forget the history that he has done. And he will use his prophets and his apostles to remind us of those histories.
What about the dinosaurs? Hang on. That's next. Any questions, discussions?
I guess it's when God had the animals, 2 by 2 getting on the ark, he didn't have the dinosaurs follow through. I don't know.
For some reason, you didn't want them in this arena.
Yeah.
So
That would be my thought. I don't know.
he didn't bring whatever animal was gonna make it into a dinosaur.
Yeah.
He didn't have that as part of the Noah's Ark. Yeah.
Genesis 6:11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. He said, more that do away with that, so, he was selected in which animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, he brought some lizards, but he didn't bring lizards.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you take a look at all the movies about dinosaurs, they're not nice.
Well, that real big one, he was a vegetarian, right?
The Brontosaurus.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but he was awfully big.
Yeah,
A lot of big guys.
yeah, it would have taken an awful lot of would have taken an awful lot of land to, you know,
Sustain him,
yeah, to sustain him, so,
Yeah.
all right. Let's learn about that.
Well, Marcus, I grew up on a farm, and so you see animals die and rot and all of that. It seems to me that the fossils that we have had to have come from a different process than what I saw at the farm.
Yeah, the ability to have fossils at all these wonderful fossils that we've got here, they look all really nice. It takes a
They
lot of
do.
work to make them look this way. But yeah, in the modern environments, fossilization is fantastically rare. It's really difficult to get a fossil because you really need the right kinds of conditions. Out on the farm, a cow dies, it gets brought over to a ditch and it just sits there and rots for a long
Right.
time. And the reason that it sits and rots is because it's not being covered up by sediments, by sand, silt, mud, clay. In order for a fossil to have a chance to be formed, an organism has to die, but it has to be killed under a situation in which there's lots of piling up of sediment. When you see things like the big nautiloid bed in Grand Canyon,
Right.
it tells you that all of these organisms had to be buried in one moment, and that on top of them has to go a whole bunch of sediment. Otherwise, other organisms, like the ravens and all
Right.
that sort of thing on the farm, they're going to come and pick a skeleton clean.
Yeah.
You've got to seal that away from anything. And on land, you've got certain animals, and in the ocean, you've got plenty of other animals like crabs and lobster and whatnot that go in and just start eating everything. And in the modern world today, when a whale drops out of the top of the ocean and hits the bottom, it is skeletonized. And then once the skeleton is there, there's more worms that go in and start chewing on the skeleton itself. There's no meat left. They're going after the other resources in the bones. So that whale becomes an ecological community
Right.
to feed a whole bunch of animals because nature is very efficient at recycling. Very efficient at recycling. So to stop that process, you've got to take that animal, that dinosaurs, like the stuff that we see around here, the trilobites, the nautiloids, you've got to take them out of the equation. You've got to bury them in so much sediment that nobody can get to them. And the conditions for that to occur are very rare on the world today, and yet that seems to be the dominant mode of the rock record. It's fundamentally different from our own experience.
What is it in that data that causes you to think that the Genesis paradigm has the right perspective?
Well, there's a couple of really big key areas. When we think just kind of a helicopter view looking down, there's a few things that point to us very nicely. One is that all these fossils that are found throughout the world are in rock layers that were laid down mostly under marine conditions. There's some that might be grabbing from terrestrial environments and pulling them back in, but dominantly we've got marine organisms on the continents, and that in and of itself is rather striking and surprising, right? You think, well, where are the marine organisms? Well, they're in the ocean. But the sedimentary record of the marine world is actually fantastically good on the continent. There's a lot more marine rocks on the continents than there are terrestrial rocks. And thinking in terms of a paradigm rooted in Genesis, that makes perfect sense. If the floodwaters rose and buried and covered the world, then whatever was in those oceans was drug up and placed out on the continents. We have a tendency to think that fossils are just kind of sprinkled here and there all over the place. But the fossils are only found in sedimentary rocks, so you got to have the right types of rocks around. Not every place has got them. But nonetheless, when you have sedimentary rocks, those fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed. And so in the limestone or the sandstone that's got the fossils, you might have a bunch of that limestone or sandstone that doesn't have fossils, but then there's a layer of catastrophe. There's a layer in which thousands and thousands of individuals have been buried and destroyed, and their materials have been locked up in these rocks for us to later on discover. So the numbers are mind-boggling in terms of how much is out there. If we took the world and we ran the experiment of the flood again, not that we want that to happen, what you would end up with is the same kind of pattern where you have sedimentary rocks and usually layers within those rocks that are going to have large numbers of fossils. It's the sort of thing that speaks to catastrophe, not the sort of thing where the fossil record is gradually accumulating bone by bone, shell by shell, little by little, over untold eons of time.
So you see it more as a catastrophic graveyard.
It is, and it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard, where these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continents, grabbing ecosystems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean. and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes to make, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rock, sometimes even seconds. And we know that this can happen from even modern day environments where tsunamis and the like are able to do vast amounts of geological work in effectively a split second.
Marcus, this tsunami waves, I guess you're saying, are they then building up what's called the fossil record?
They are. When a paleontologist talks about the fossil record, he's thinking vertically. He's thinking about different sorts of fossils that are in different layers of rock, and not necessarily something like, well, this one's in a sandstone, this one's in a limestone. They're thinking about what is the position of this fossil with respect to some other species in the fossil record, and thinking in a vertical column sort of situation. We're also thinking a bit about, you know, what type of fossilization is going on, what's the nature and character of the unit. So in some fossil areas, you've got underwater creatures and all the shells are broken to pieces and they're all kind of ripped up together and put into this one big mass. And other times you've got deposits where everybody seems to be perfectly preserved and really nice, like the Burgess Shale, which is got lots of mud, very fine material, and all of these creatures are just pristinely preserved so that we can even see soft part anatomy, things like the feathery gills of a trilobite or the soft tissues of a worm or a mollusk of some kind.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways, the movements that they left behind. So in North America, for example, the first dinosaurs are in what are called Triassic sediments. Now, these are units about halfway up in the fossil record and what I would consider to be about midpoint of the flood or so. But the first record of dinosaurs in North America are not the bones, footprints.
Oh, really?
Now, this is a pattern that's repeated in several different areas. Some of our very first amphibian fossils in the rock record, a little bit lower down, are footprints, not hard parts. They're not skeletons, they're not jaws, they're not teeth, they're not bones. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups, trilobites included, where their footprints are first and their body parts are later.
Now, when you say first, you're talking about in lower layers?
Right. A geologist always thinks kind of from the bottom going up, or at least a paleontologist does. So first appearance is the first time I see from the bottom going up a particular type of animal, plant, or creature. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not the hard parts, not the shells, not the teeth, not the bones. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because teeth and shells and bones fossilize really well. You have a lot more of those in the fossil record than we have trackways. Because trackways are made on soft mud, they're easy to wipe out. You think about when you go to the beach and you leave some trackways there, they're gone with the next wave. But when it comes to the fossil record from a global flood perspective, starting in Genesis and recognizing that the flood is a dynamic and destructive event, we have evidence of these animals running away from whatever's coming. To have that next wave of sediment bury their tracks and then bury them in maybe the swashback that's coming back from the shore area. And so the discovery of a pattern here, and this is important, it's not just an isolated fact, it's a pattern of trackways followed by bones and teeth and shells that says there's not much time between the formation of this trackway and the discovery of the trilobite or the dinosaur. From an old Earth perspective, you've got to have maybe millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? You roll the dice that bones and teeth and shells are going to come up first almost every time. But here in the fossil record, it's like you've rolled snake eyes 10 times in a row. Something's wrong with the pattern. Instead, the pattern's telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried. The second part is actually a little bit more subtle, gets to another one of those weird patterns in the fossil record, and that is the lack of organisms in the sediment to churn it up. So when you were in the Grand Canyon, you saw lots of layers. That layering is interesting because in the modern world, If you've got nice layers in the ocean, one right after another, all these nice little layers, well, there's animals that dig down and eat all the organic material that's in those layers. You have worms, you have clams, and they're going up and down through all those layers, and as they do, they destroy the layers.
Yeah.
But in the fossil record, we have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. Everything is these really nice fine layers, and there's very little evidence of animals having the time to go and churn up through. So this gets to that trackway. Not only did the trackway have to be buried because on the surface it's easily eroded, it also has to be buried very, very quickly because there are critters that under normal today's circumstances would destroy those things. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. It's showing us an environment where organisms are fleeing, they're being buried very quickly, and they're being buried so quickly that the animals don't have time to do their normal day-to-day life. By the more sediment that piles up on top of them, they die.
Right.
They don't have time to live their lives, and we don't see them living their lives in the fossil record.
And the fact that we have so many fossils instead of millions and millions of different little special events, it seems more plausible that it was a single event.
It does, and recognizing also that the flood is a single event, but a singular event, right? It's something that was altogether different from the rest of human history. And it's a complex sort of thing, and we as creation geologists are only really at the tip of the iceberg trying to figure out the dynamics of the flood. We have this view that the flood is kind of like Winnie the Pooh and the big rain in the 100-acre woods, right? The rain came down in a 100-acre forest.
That's right.
But the reality is this was a tremendously dynamic and destructive event that has a whole bunch of mini events happening within it. And every one of those beds that has the nautiloids, every one of the beds that has a whole range of destroyed dinosaurs, every one of those is a particular event that's happening within the broader context of the destruction of Noah's flood.
Marcus, Stuart and I were talking about the complexity, the design of the creatures. Do you as a paleontologist see that in that fossil record as well?
Absolutely. So in the Cambrian, with the first layers of rock that have lots of fossils in them, called the Cambrian explosion, you have things like trilobites that show up for the first time, looking from the bottom up. And they have eyes, and those eyes are complex, not just a little complex, but tremendously complex. If you've ever taken a look at a dragonfly up close, right, and you see the eye, you see this beautiful round eye, and then up close you look in and there's dozens of little lenses that make up that eye. So the dragonfly can see all over. You can never sneak up on one, right? Trilobites likewise had compound eyes, one eye with dozens of lenses on it that allowed them to see all over the place, behind them, in front of them, on the sides, to avoid predators. For some of the trilobites, though, it got even better. There's a group called the Phaeocopsids, and these ones have eyes that not only were able to see all around, but each lens was made up of two different types of minerals, biological minerals, if you will, that allowed them to correct for what happens to water and the distortion that happens in water. So if you try and look underwater, it gets all fuzzy and weird and gets kind of circular. These eyes in some of these trilobites are the most complex eyes in the entire world. And we don't even have them anymore. God built them in the trilobites from the very beginning. And it took us thousands of years before we could figure out a design solution that could allow us to perceive light better than a trilobite did. And there's only two different types of lenses that we've ever devised that could do this. The trilobites actually have both of them. And so when we think about the complexity of an organism, you can break it down to its component parts and look at the eyes and say these things are fantastically complicated. And it takes biological information to code for all that. And then that eye also has to be wired into the brain in such a way that the brain is capable of taking in dozens of images at once and forming them into a coherent picture of the world for that organism. These are levels of complexity that far exceed any of our engineering capabilities. None of the cameras that we have built are anywhere near as complicated as some of the first eyes that we see in the lowermost ecosystems. It tells us that when these ecosystems were destroyed, they were fully complex structures, with fully complex organisms, with fully complex components. The complexity just keeps going all the way down.
So again, it makes more sense to think that that life that's in the fossil record was already there and just got captured in its death moments, as opposed to thinking that this is a record that shows how life slowly began to evolve, because it's so complex
It's
right
so
from the
complex.
beginning.
And as you go into the rocks below where the trilobites are, you don't find creatures that have slightly less complex eyes and slightly less complex eyes and that gradation that Darwin was expecting and that my colleagues expect to find is still not there. It's not that we haven't been looking. There are hundreds of paleontologists who have been doing a lot of good work over the past few hundred years, and yet the pattern still shows us complexity comes first, and variations on the themes of those complexities come later. That's exactly what we do as engineers and as intelligent agents ourselves. When we create things, we come up with an idea, we create a pattern, we create a system, it's complex, it's whole, it's integrated, and then we decide we want to tweak it. Somebody comes up with an invention, it works good, but then the modifications come around. And not that God has to modify his creatures, but the pattern of an idea and the variations on those ideas are exactly the signal that we get from design systems, and not the signal that you get from things that arise organically out of physics and chemistry.
Do you see that same complexity in the design as you see it in the eye of a trilobite? Now when we come to these amazing engineered creatures that are right here in dinosaurs and the creatures that flew.
Yeah. So, for example, we've got this Apatosaurus behind us. This is the long-necked dinosaur. It's big, and it's one of the largest animals ever to walk on Earth. It weighed a couple dozen tons, and it's got to be able to support that weight as it walks on land, because they probably didn't spend a lot of time swimming in swamps, despite the early dinosaur books that we had. These animals are built to be on land. Now, that Apatosaurus, you can see the front legs down over there and down towards the toes. It's actually walking on its toes. Its fingers are like this.
Huh.
But the fingers have to, if you and I just tried to do that on our toes all day,
I wouldn't last long.
it's not going to last long. And so the design feature that we see here is actually that the fingers curl around into a column to help distribute the weight evenly across the front paw of the animal. The back legs are doing the same thing. Our hands and our feet are more or less flat, one way or the other. But the Apatosaurus and all of its close kin that have these big long necks and these huge bodies, those structures are rolled into a column so that the weight can be distributed evenly amongst the toes that are going to the ground. There's probably a big pad of flesh down behind it to help add a little bit of surface area. Elephants do the same sort of thing. These are the types of structures that are design marvels, right? They're engineering approaches to distributing weight. And even the long neck and the really long tail on these sorts of things are effectively cantilevers. They are held out by tendons and ligaments in order to keep them nice and stiff and straight, so that you don't have to use a lot of muscle to hold up your tail. Instead, you've got a kind of like an iron bar of a tendon,
Right, yeah.
holding these things out. So when I get a chance to look up close at something like this Apatosaurus or any of the other dinosaurs and other animals that are out there, you start looking at the details of their anatomy and go, wow, this fulfills this function. This does this role, this performs this for the animal. And this is not the sort of thing that ends up accumulating by happenstance. Despite natural selection's capabilities of kind of selecting some things that work, natural selection tinkers with things. And tinkering is something that you can do once something is built. You don't tinker your way into a complex structure. You tinker around with it. And so looking at these animals, complexity from tip to snout, from one end to the other, and all of that is shown in a variety of different skeletal structures.
And we're talking about exquisite design just within a land animal, but we also have not only sea creatures, but we have creatures that fly, but for me is an amazing, amazing capability.
Yeah, they don't have jet propulsion, they don't have propellers, so how do they do it? And bats fly, birds fly, and pterosaurs, which are extinct, fly. Those are the three animals that really have powered flight that are vertebrates. We've got insects and whatnot, and they have their own amazing systems for doing these sorts of things. If you want to fly, you've got to be lightweight. Hollow bones are something that both pterosaurs and birds have in order to lighten the weight. You tend to have very compact bodies. There's a couple of pterosaur fossils that are around here. And the middle of those animals are actually really small. And the design of the wings is spectacular. For a pterodactyl, they actually have their pinky is the big wing. Right? They've got a couple of fingers that stick out, but those are to help them walk along on the ground when they come down. But the pinky finger is enormous and holds holds out to the end, and there's a flap of skin that goes from there all the way down to their ankle. And that flap of skin is made up of at least 3 different layers of material that we know from soft tissue preserved fossils. So we've got a chance to see a little bit of the actual anatomy of the animal in these. And you've got thin muscle layers, you've got a layer of blood vessels, you also have some specialized material that no other animal on the planet has got in order to make this thing do what it does. And scenarios in which evolution has got to produce these things without any forethought to what's going on into the future simply don't have the capacity to create something this complicated.
Well, Mark, this is very interesting to me because I remember hearing stories of how animals just all of a sudden grew wings. And yet what you're saying is that that animal had to be fully ready to fly, hollow bones and all of those kind of things. It couldn't just grow a wing and then start flying.
Right. I mean, the mechanics of flight are very demanding. And as someone who's been in the Air Force, you understand that. So you can't just happenstance your way by growing a little bit longer wing digit or growing a little bit smaller body trunk or growing a little bit more kind of feathery, fluffy material in order to eventually become a bird. There's got to be functionality from the beginning point all the way to the end. That's a very demanding sort of problem. You know, what good is half the wing going to do for you? Because there's a certain practicality that's necessary for being on the ground, and there's a certain practicality that exists for being in the air.
Hey, what did we learn? What did you guys learn on that? I learned a lot.
Fossilized it had to happen. That's
Exactly. And I liked, it was one of those, you know, hit your head kind of things when he was saying that, you know, the long earth or the old earth concept is that, you know, here's your rock layers all the way up through, right? So they're saying that this group down here were the first ones to be around. Okay, and from there, you started evolution into something more complex as things moved up like this. Okay, but what he's saying is that during the flood, you turn this on its side. Okay, what's the first things that got thrown up onto the ocean or from onto land from when the tectonic plates started moving and you know the springs came up from the bottom, which vaporized itself. Okay, those deep sea animals were the first things to thrust up. Okay, so they're you know, like we're talking, they're saying like billions of years happened between this layer and this layer. So what was in that next layer was a little bit more complex. So, you know, you're building up, but they haven't found those in between things that were built. Like
first they
flight.
only had feet.
Yeah, first they yeah.
Just feet.
Okay, and then you take a look at what he was just saying there about how complex life was in just a little trilobite. You know, it had lenses that they were able to see better in the water already built in. And they were down here. And next week you'll see that someone will say, okay, you found a duckbill platypus right here. And then you found another one up here in this layer. To an evolutionist, that doesn't make sense. They should all be right here and a different version of it up here. But they're the same in those two. It's just whichever layer, you know, the water was getting to that spot and laying it down. And you're correct. I mean, you can't make fossils today. It's extremely difficult because sediment isn't happening. They said that during, you know, like that the hurricane, I think that in New York, where it brought a lot of sediment. I forget how deep it was, but it was quite a bit. But you go back there after a year, it was all demolished because all those little critters got in there and moved up and down and ate everything up
Okay.
through and basic, so it wasn't like what this was. And the track waves is, you heard, I thought it was amazing that you'll see it in this layer, and then the animal bones are up in this layer up here from the same animal.
And Nate showing us the tracks. On Green
Mhm.
Cable. It says all the tracks are always going uphill.
Yeah, yeah,
As if they're running
And
away from
scurrying.
something.
and then,
As fast as they can.
what's that?
As fast as they can.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're underwater probably, you have to think, they're probably already underwater at that time.
Well, probably not water, it's flow. Of
Right.
mud.
Well, I was gonna say,
Which
how did
covered
the
those
mud
tracks
get there?
quicker. Hmm?
The mud was created when the continents smashed together and it threw sediment,
No.
and
that-
then they
that was-
ran tracks. How did the tracks get?
Well, as the waters were rising on the continents, they're trying to get away from the water. Cause they're probably already underwater when they're scurrying away. And it just keeps rising because the rains are coming down. And the water is rising up from the bottom, it's gonna get you.
Right, well, I was
So-
just wondering about the ground, how the ground got wet enough that you would leave a print.
Cause it's already covered.
So you got waves of sediment coming in, mud,
Well, that's what I was asking.
right?
Mhm.
So you got this mud comes flowing in and then maybe there's a little pause. When the critters are now walking in that mud and leaving their footprints, and then another wave comes through. And pushes that down.
So layer of the layer.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it continues too.
This reminds us of how violent and what a gigantic event the flood is. I mean, we think the flood, the waters, but is this like everything exploding? Like the metal of the earth and the molten, it's not even lava, lava's from the top. This is like the plates opening up and
Mhm.
it's-
And it didn't settle down. I mean, we're still,
No.
and one thing, we haven't shown this one about, when he said, yeah, of course climate's changing. Climate change, we're still trying to, the earth is still trying to recover from this event, the flood. It's gonna continue, So, yeah, some other things that they learned. This learned.
In the first video, when you mentioned that, they have fossils of animals and all the other artifacts, but they have nothing human beings. And, I was kind of like curious to really wonder, and I just went back to Genesis chapter 7,
Mhm.
where, let me see. Verse is it 36, the waters rose 15 cubits higher as the mountains were covered, all flesh perished, those that crawl on the land, and the flying creatures, livestock, wild animals, all creatures that swarm upon the land, and all humankind. Everything that had the breath of the spirit of life in its nostril. Everything on dry land died. So he, referring to the Lord, wiped out all existence.
Mhm.
And I just thought about, I would be curious to know what is the Hebraic root for the word wiped out. Because we have no evidence. Of course, evolutionists will say that we have evolved, whatever.
Mhm.
But there is no evidence to say what actually happened to, a body or something, human beings, like they just disintegrated, disappeared like that. So I just wondered what he meant that the Lord wiped them out. I mean, we think of wiped out as being killed, but does it have another underlying meaning?
I think Tom's on it.
Yeah.
Looking at verse 23, it's a good choice.
Well, I think, obviously,
Lord, I think,
Chapter
chapter 7, verse 1.
The 23, so he wiped out all existence that was up on the surface of the ground.
He raised smooth as with oil, grease or with fat. Reached to abolish, blot out, destroy, full of marrow, they're out.
there's just some questions we don't
Utterly
know.
wipe away, those are the,
And
Well, I
like,
took it to understand that there were no humans on the bottom layer because that's where the footprints were. And the humans were found above.
But they haven't found any.
well,
They found them
They
above.
found some
Yeah,
way,
they-
way at the top at the end of the
Yeah.
flood, which, but as far as the amount of people during Noah's time,
Mhm.
there were people here.
Yeah.
And that's the ones that they haven't found, and he had said, that's just something that they haven't yet.
Yeah,
Now, Tom showed me a picture that was on his screensaver. And he came and got me and said, oh, look at how nice all those layers are. I mean, it's just one big giant a column all the way up through and stuff. Are there human fossils in the middle of that we're never gonna see?
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible. I don't know. That's a question we can ask the Lord when we get there.
Not everything that died was fossilized,
Right.
some things did rot away.
Mhm.
you see, that's where I get confused. I thought, like an animal, I thought if it got caught, it was fossilized.
For sure.
Mhm. Here it did why? Because it was covered quickly, very
Right,
quickly.
that's why I hate to be I just wonder about the footprints. There's nothing in that footprint when the mud
Right.
came in.
Right. How did it get preserved
Yeah, that's
as a
my,
footprint?
yeah.
Jesus.
That'd be the right kind of. money.
Because
Cause I thought it had to be caught there, or maybe he lost his foot,
Because the Lord knew at some time in time, there were gonna be creation scientists that would have figured out exactly that you find the track waves first, and then the body was buried later on.
But if the people were caught up in the water, I mean, the water itself, and they didn't even make it to the where there's,
Where the safety,
yeah,
Smart enough to avoid.
then they would be just rotting in the water. They
Yeah.
wouldn't be fossilized.
it's a possibility.
Well, he
Nobody
said one
knows.
theory was the population wasn't huge. That's a
Yeah.
theory,
Mhm.
as compared to today.
I remember the fathers lived 900 years.
Well, I'm just saying what he said.
1,000 years.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I think they found when they had that big tsunami. Was it Japan or Philippines? I can't remember where,
Both.
but the animals were leaving, they were heading inland. And the people were on the beach and everything.
Yeah.
and
Oh,
they-
look at the pretty wave.
Yeah, so I mean, if they're that stupid, then, I mean, follow the animals, they know.
Did they ever see rain before?
Yeah.
They never saw rain then.
So they might have just
didn't
stood
know.
there and like.
Yeah, it's like,
What's going on?
oh, what's this? Why is he building that stupid
Yeah.
boat? What's
Yeah,
that
and
ever
then they
gonna do?
find mussels and shells and stuff on Everest, so they were climbing up,
Oh, that's because, the earth was covered.
Yeah.
The whole earth was covered.
Right.
The Adirondacks, if you remember, one of the very first things was the thing. Out in New Mexico and Arizona, they have sediment that came off of the Appalachian Mountains. Out there, because it was in the flood. That's why the mountains on the eastern side aren't as big. As what the western side is, because they were made with the flood. And it was, like you said, they could have been even taller than the Himalayas. But they were eroded.
When you're down in the Grand Canyon, and you're looking up a
Mhm.
mile, that's a
Or more.
mile of sedimentary rock that goes from
Mhm.
here's here, where did all that come from?
Mm.
And I analyzed the rock, composition of the rock, and what matches up with that, stuff on the East Coast.
And that, when they show, okay, this limestone section here, the peat sandstones or whatever like that. Follow this whole area. Remember the one that went all the way through into Africa, same exact layers, same exact columns and all that kind of stuff.
So I think the other day was about tsunamis and all that,
You were?
that last one that we had, it said that was the strongest earthquake that Earth had ever seen, just one. And it said it made waves 625 miles an hour and 100 feet tall.
Mhm.
So you can imagine the whole Earth is flooded. Those waves and power must have been incredible just to wipe off the top of it.
And they're saying, the plate tectonics are only a couple centimeters a year,
Yeah.
where they're going two miles an hour or something like that. And I mean, it was. I mean,
Giant wave. Yeah, I don't know.
It's a giant wave and a giant the continents. Tectonic.
And just from living by the shore, when you see that hurricane come through,
Mhm,
and you just see, those are relatively small waves,
mhm.
15, 20 feet. I mean, when they come in and go over that dune, they just wipe out everything.
Well, you also, back, try to remember some of the first ones that we were saying about the mud flows.
Yeah.
The mud flows they still happen in the ocean. They're saying that their mud flows go all the way down through, and they cut caverns in an instant.
So, and that's just a small thing. Imagine when you like, for everything opened up, giant things.
Mhm.
Well, add one more to that, you've got the tides that come in, and bounce against the wall, it comes up on the shore. Well, there's no shore.
Just
The
keep
tide
going.
just keep going all the way around.
That's what I
How
figured,
big
just
is
keeps
it gonna
going all
get?
around, or it just keeps dragging
Yeah.
stuff along.
Yes.
It's amazing God didn't have Noah build a submarine.
Yes.
The way those waves going over.
I'm not sure a wooden one would do, but you never know. Well, like God said, he's never gonna do it again because he gave us a promise in the rainbows. That he's never gonna ruin the earth by flood again.
We'll do that.
Not gonna do that again, but what's coming next?
Fire.
Fire next time. So,
Fires, it's catastrophic.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that'll melt.
Not gonna be a little bonfire.
So. 5 alarm fire. So. Well, more dinosaurs next week with a guy who's actually out on a dig, and he's got some information as well on that. So got a lot of stuff still going and whatnot. So when you guys are tired of it, just let us know. We'll end it. But
And these guys keep publishing them.
I told Jim, I said, the stars has a great story about it, but the planets, you'd be surprised at what the moon does for us. But I won't
Don't spoil it.
I won't spoil it. I won't spoil it. And he went, the guy that's in here went on the, was on our canyon trip with us. Wow. So Jim has his phone number.
Well, I know that a full moon affects crime and injuries. It does, it just increases everything.
Correct, spaces go cuckoo.
Yes, and the moon does a lot of other things too.
I mean, saying, yeah.
It's quite a story. Mhm. All right, so let's end off in a word of prayer. We're already late. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the study this morning. And that some of the magnificent creatures that you had on this earth, that you no longer want on this earth. We thank you for all of this learning. Help us to continue to seek it out, to learn more about your creation. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.